Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third and last of our three lectures on the Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. We've all met, but just for the record, I'm David Beckman, the director of the Study Center of Chattanooga. And if you've missed our previous lectures on the Abolition of Man, you can watch them on YouTube. You'll find the links on the news and events page of our website, which is simply ChattanoogaStudyCenter.org, all one word, ChattanoogaStudyCenter.org. And I invite you to go there for those. Tonight, for our final lecture, we are privileged to have with us Dr. Bryan Hampton. Dr. Hampton is James D. Kennedy Distinguished Teaching Professor and Senior Associate Head of the Department of English here at UTC. He's also the author of a book entitled Fleshly Tabernacles, Milton and the Incarnational Poetics of Revolutionary England. I love the Stuart period, which I do recommend to you. Beloved by his students, Dr. Hampton is also a deacon at his church and serves on the board of the Study Center. He has given excellent lectures for us on a number of occasions in the past, and we're looking forward to the lecture tonight, which he has entitled Jack and Two Johns, Bunyan, Milton, and the Abolition of Man. Do please welcome with me Dr. Hampton.
I don't know if that's the ideal spot or not.
It'll be fine.
Okay.
It'll be just fine.
All right. Thanks, you fellow fit company that we have here today. I thought about titling this A Jack on Two Johns, but then I thought it might communicate the wrong thing. And the idea for this really emerged from the epigraph that C.S. Lewis attaches to the third chapter from Bunyan's work. And so that's where I'm headed. So C.S. Lewis was an insightful reader of John Milton's great poem, Paradise Lost. And he demonstrates in his 1942 book, A Preface to Paradise Lost. And although I disagree with Lewis's tendency sometimes to minimize the significance of some of Milton's more unorthodox beliefs that may creep into the poem, but are certainly part of a longer theological treatise that is attributed to Milton, I find him to be largely accurate about the character of Satan in Paradise Lost. I don't know if Lewis ever saw a Looney Tunes cartoon, but as he memorably remarks throughout the poem, Satan, quote, is engaged in sawing off the branch he is sitting on. His tragedy and his mockery is to be found in the fact that, quote, a creature revolting against his creator is revolting against the source of his own powers, including even the power to revolt, end quote. This is what Lewis terms the satanic predicament. And part of what I want to address regarding the last chapter of Lewis's The Abolition of Man. Because I'm a literature professor, what I hope to offer here is a sketch of how Lewis's deep literary commitments with two 17th century writers, John Milton and John Bunyan, converge and perhaps comment on the concluding argument of the abolition of men. And since I have the task of saying something witty and engaging about the last chapter of the book, perhaps for the sake of context, I should summarize what's come before. I'll keep it brief. On the whole, the book is concerned with, quote, how human beings relate to reality, as Michael Ward puts it in his recent commentary on the book. Here it is right here. It's After Humanity, a Guide to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. And I recommend it. It provides great context for the book itself. It explores the chapters in themselves, the allusions and references that come up in the argument, if you're interested in that. Otherwise, Michael Ward explains it this way, or asks it this way: does what we say about things correspond to how they really are? In chapter 1, Lewis objects to an actual education primer that he refers to as the Green Book, that debunks the idea that things in themselves, a powerful waterfall, for instance, have a shared objective value, and that when we talk about them, we are really only articulating our feelings about them. In chapter 2, Lewis introduces the idea of the Tao, the unifying idea in every major world religion that moral and ethical reality are universal and thus objective. And finally, in chapter 3, Lewis thinks through the consequences of a humanity without objective reality and value. In that world, human beings are raw materials to be used and manipulated by whoever happens to be in control and exercising power. When the Tao is abandoned, willpower and technological control alone rule the day. So that's the summary of Lewis's book. So the third and last chapter of Abolition begins with an epigraph by John Bunyan, one of John Milton's 17th century contemporaries and the author of one of the best-selling books of all time, Pilgrim's Progress from 1678. It's worth thinking through a bit the significance of Lewis choosing the epigraph that he does as some way to frame the argument of chapter 3. Bunyan's allegory follows the journey of a man named Christian, who's warned by Evangelist to flee his city of destruction towards the celestial city. Along the way, he's joined by his friends Faithful and Hope, and is confronted by the secular traps represented by characters such as Obstinate, Pliable, and Lord Hategood, as well as sluggish mires like the Slough of Despond and flashy attractions like Vanity Fair. And if you haven't picked this up yet, Bunyan's allegory is very thin. Lewis's epigraph centers on a short conversation between Faithful and Christian, where Faithful tells his friend about an aged man that he had met at the Hill of Difficulty, named Adam the First. I've got this quote for you here. "At first I found myself somewhat inclinable to go with the man, for he spake very fair. But looking in his forehead as I talked with him, I saw there written, 'Put off the old man with his deeds.'" And Christian responds, "Well, then what happened? And then what?" So Lewis's epigraph begins after Christian asks about what came next. Quote, "It came burning hot into my mind. Whatever he said and however he flattered, when he got me home to his house, he would sell me for a slave." So Faithful admits how seductively Adam the First spoke about securing one's place in the world, offering Faithful all the, quote, dainties of the world, including all 3 of his daughters, to wed, with such provocative names as lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, and pride of life. Who would turn down such tantalizing prizes? But Faithful sees, after his realization of what Adam was truly offering, enslavement, only to be pursued and knocked down the hill by Adam's thug named Moses. Faithful tells Christian that he believed Moses would have struck him a death blow had not an unnamed man with, quote, holes in his hands intervened. As you might gather, the thrust of Bunyan's allegory at this point argues that Adam the First is stuck keeping his own misguided ideals, stuck in the framework of his own complacency, and stuck in the glow of his own accomplishments. making a prisoner of anyone who would dwell with him. The hill of difficulty is only ascended by the second Adam, that is Christ, who by his deeds, evidenced by the nail holes in his hands, can deliver the faithful to the authentic celestial city and prevent them from settling for an imitation, a cheapened version of home, a cheapened version of satisfaction, a cheapened version of the self. Christian nearly falls into the same trap as faithful. And here in this slide, I've got an image of Christian. He's weighed down by this great burden on his back that he carries through much of Pilgrim's Progress, carrying the book that evangelist gave him, which is symbolic of the Bible. Along the way, he meets Mr. Worldly Wise Man, quote, who looked like a gentleman, end quote, and advises that until Christian rids himself of the great burden that he physically carries on his back, he will never, quote, enjoy the benefits of the blessing that which God hath bestowed upon thee, end quote. He promises that he can deliver Christian of this burden if he climbs up the same hill of difficulty to find the village of morality, where he himself dwells, and to seek out the house of his friend, Mr. Legality, and Mr. Legality's beautiful son, Mr. Civility. As Bunyan implies, Mr. Worldly Wise believes that freedom is to be found in the progress of civilization, in following the world's desires and accepting how it defines order and propriety. Christian's instruction by evangelist had been to find the narrow wicket gate that leads to the right path. But Mr. Worldly Wise Man condemns that way, telling him that following that advice will make him weak and unmanly. And he speculates that Christian is, quote, like to meet with in the way which thou goest, wearisomeness, painfulness, hunger, perils, nakedness, sword, lions, dragons, darkness, and in a word, death, end quote. When Christian falters for fear of the climb up the hill of difficulty, evangelist appears and he does not deny the dangers that are ahead of him. But he comments that Mr. Worldly Wise Man loves his village and his neighbors because, quote, it saveth him from the cross, end quote. Evangelist's point is that the civility and morality are not the same as the message of the cross. Though some, like Mr. Worldly Wise Man, may like to think that they are all defining love, sacrifice, gentleness, joy, humility, order, friendship, authority, and self-control in the same way. So part of Bunyan's task, I think, through Pilgrim's Progress is to show how the self, which is figured principally through the protagonist Christian and some of his fellow travelers, but also demonstrated, I think, through the various antagonists that he meets. And I've got a few slides here from an 18th century illustrated edition. Down here on the bottom left is Christian being pulled out of the slough of despond. Up from that is Christian talking to Mr. Worldly Wise Man. To the right of that is him at the city Vanity Fair. Then below that is the wicket gate, and then finally to the bottom right is the giant despair. So part of Bunyan's task throughout is to show how the self willingly attaches or submits itself to some kind of authority that promises something in return. As the narrative demonstrates, that promise often turns out to be illusory, delaying, unfulfilling, or enslaving. As Michael Ward comments, Lewis's epigraph signifies, quote, the rightful abolition of man by the cross. The irony of Lewis's chapter and Bunyan's narrative is that human beings, in all of their sovereignty, real or imagined, are always also looking to become servants of something in order to become masters of themselves and masters of the reality around them. Bunyan's character of Christian is an everyman figure, making a pilgrimage towards freedom. Freedom from the great burden he physically carries on his back, emblematic of sin, of hurt, of betrayal, of disappointment, of despair, of the past. His desperation to be delivered of that burden is everyone's burden, whether we're talking about the church or the secular world. John Milton's character of Satan, too, wishes to be delivered from his newfound pain and despair, following his failed rebellion against heaven's king. To be fair, few readers of Paradise Lost encounter Satan's plight in the epic without experiencing some view of sympathy towards him, however brief or sustained. But the miserable state of his tortured mind, the unforeseen ripple effects of his catastrophic fall, the vivid portrayals of his subsequent degeneration from immense titan and charismatic general to crafty politician to a squatting toad to amorphous mist to a golden serpent and finally to a horrid dragon, Milton draws this out like a razor. In his book on Milton's epic, Lewis rebukes those who understand this remarkable degeneration as some late and desperate attempt on Milton's part to confine a dynamic and sympathetic character that had threatened to take over the epic. Instead, Lewis reasserts that Milton knew precisely what he was doing. Satan did not take him by surprise as a character. Rather, quote, here's Lewis, it was the poet's intention to be fair to evil, to give it a run for its money, to show it first at the height with all its rants and melodrama, and then to trace what actually becomes of such self-intoxication when it encounters reality, end quote. A critic named Dustin Griffin argues that while Milton may often be pointing the finger at Satan and the demons and rendering judgment, he is just as often pointing the finger at the reader, quote, to see that the scene and the problem are ultimately his own. In part by means of the fallen angels, Milton teaches a reader both to see and to judge himself, end quote. Thus, in some way, Satan's fallen predicament in the poem, that image of him sawing himself off of the branch connected to the tree, the detached, that is the self that's detached from true authority, a self that desires to make his own culture in hell, that bears his own image, is also the reader's predicament of how to understand the self. Is the self its own authority? Or does the self only become a truer self by submitting to something greater, gooder, beautifuler, and truer than the self? Milton seems to offer two choices before his readers. A hellish version of the self that maintains that it is its own cause, self-generating, and therefore believing itself to be self-sustaining and self-guiding. Or a heavenly version of the self that recognizes with St. Paul that it is in God that, quote, we live and move and have our being, as he says in Acts 17:28. In Book 2 of the epic, we're drawn into a series of debates by the fallen angels about how to proceed now that they've just been vanquished from heaven. The plan that gains the most applause is proposed by Mammon. And I've got the quote on there from Paradise Lost. Nor want we skill or art from whence to raise magnificence. And what can heaven show more? In these lines, understands Lewis, we find the kernel of hell. And here's how he thinks about these two lines. In those words, we read Mammon to the very bottom. He believes that hell can be made into a substitute for heaven. For everything that has been lost, you can find something else that will do quite as well. Heaven was magnificent. If hell is made equally magnificent, it must be just as good. Everything can be imitated, and the imitation will do just as well as the real thing. The self, even Milton's depiction of the demonic self, cannot remain radically detached. Mammon's plan has already been put into action, for the fallen angels now debating have gathered in Mammon's ornately constructed temple-like structure, whose description runs about 20 lines. Milton, however, effectively deconstructs its glory with one word, by referring to it as the ascending pile. Now, as it meant then, a pile is a disordered stack of things, but there are at least two additional meanings that the word carried in Milton's day that we no longer retain, but which may prove illuminating. First, a pile is, quote, a pointed head of a dart or a spear. And perhaps Milton intended this meaning to suggest something about the piercing and wounding nature of evil that masquerades as something good and beautiful. But I can hardly restrain myself from pairing this pointed meaning of the word with another. In the 17th century, a pile is synonymous with a hemorrhoid. Insert your own vulgarity, but Milton's hair is both inflamed, that is, consumed by fire, and inflamed, that is, scatologically swollen. So we might conclude that the difference between the satanic self and Milton's authentic self is the gulf between scatology and eschatology, or to put it another way, between excrement and sacrament. So some of the aims of Lewis's last chapter in the Abolition seem akin to Bunyan's and Milton's larger strategies, though Lewis's argument is less explicitly Christian. As Michael Ward points out, the Abolition is, quote, not an apologia for Christianity, nor even for theism, end quote, but it does employ its argument. It does employ in its argument what we might call common grace that emerges in the various moral traditions that make up what Lewis calls the Tao. All these moral traditions are brought into conjunction by, quote, a strong central unifying principle, namely objective value, a universally recognized moral code which requires obedience from all human beings, end quote. That's Ward. To do away with that objective reality of right and wrong, as Lewis's Tao would seem to indicate, is to affirm only arbitrary power that arbitrarily affirms itself until the next power comes along and does the same. These arbitrary powers are the ones that Lewis names the conditioners in chapter 3. Those in the minority who have decided for the majority, and perhaps even those of future generations, what to be human means, and whose judgment values of good or bad are located only in proximity to the vision of progress, technology, and humanity that they are currently selling. Without the guiding influence and stability of the Tao, Lewis implies, not only are the definitions of good and evil constantly in flux, but the nature of the self is always changing as well in conformity to or rejection of the new definitions. He bluntly puts it this way: either we are rational spirit, obliged forever to obey the absolute values of the Tao, or else we are mere nature, that is, raw material, to be kneaded and cut into new shapes for the pleasures of masters who must, by hypothesis, have no motive but their own natural impulses. Only the Tao provides a common human law of action, which can overarch rulers and ruled alike. He continues, a dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of a rule which is not tyranny, or an obedience which is not slavery. In other words, the authentic freedom of the self, both in the rulers and in the ruled, is tethered to the idea of recognizing objective value. Lewis's idea of the Tao encapsulates the idea that objective reality operates over and above the subjective will and power to define reality. The quest of Bunyan's Christian is to realize that it is the cross which defines good and evil and provides the proper scaffolding for building a life that goes beyond his own subjective desires, his own pains and his own joys. His way of salvation lies through his entering through the narrowness of the wicket gate, that is, the gate's narrow and thus specific definitions of sin, guilt, and shame, as well as its definitions of goodness, truth, and authority. It's when Christian beholds one, quote, hanging bleeding upon the tree, that the very sight of him made my burden fall off my back, end quote. And he is stripped of his rags, marked in his forehead, clothed in a quote-unquote broidered coat, and declared forgiven and free. Meanwhile, there's no possibility for Milton's Satan or his fellow fallen angels to attach themselves any longer to any objective authority like God. They live adrift in a world of subjectivism. They wander hell's landscape, quote, each his several way, where he may likeliest find truce to his restless thoughts, end quote. They write epic poems about themselves and invent heroic deeds concerning their, quote, hapless fall by doom of battle, end quote. They try to do philosophy to find out about, quote, providence, foreknowledge, will, and fate. And they argue about, quote, good or evil, of happiness and final misery, passion and apathy, but are endlessly, quote, wandering in mazes lost. As Lewis pithily states, the hell within that every fallen angel in Paradise Lost lives is, quote, a hell of infinite boredom. It's a limited reality with no other frame of reference, and from which there is no escape. It is a totality given over to, quote, propaganda, wishful thinking, and incessant autobiography, end quote. In short, it sounds like Milton has anticipated the ripple effects of social media. Milton's hell is characterized by restlessness, intimidation, self-interest, and a calculus of violence. And I think this is also the danger that Lewis foresees if humanity abandons the Tao and the principle of objective value. That is a world of, quote, post-humanity, as Lewis puts it, where human being and living are reduced to raw material for manipulation by the powers that be, for the moment that is. For Lewis, that post-humanity will be like Milton's hell, which settles for cheap imitations. To revisit his comments on Mammon's suggestion that the fallen can make a heaven of hell, everything can be imitated, and the imitation will do just as well as the real thing. For Lewis, the real thing is the Tao, and everything that is erected outside of it is only a tragic parody. That's all I got for you tonight.